Thank you very much. It's an enormous honour and privilege to be invited to come and give this talk today. And I'm very aware of this programme and how well it's doing, and it's also the 25th anniversary of the Independent University of Split, so it's a really great honour to be asked to come and contribute in this way. In preparation for this talk, it's a slightly different talk than any other I've given before. I was beginning to think about the sort of subject area that Olivia's sort of mapped out here, and I realised that one of the things I realised that perhaps I already knew was you learn quite a lot more from the sort of challenges and setbacks you have, and the outright disasters, basically. But you come through them. That's the thing. That's the underlying message, and you learn from them. And it was sort of quite interesting for me, and actually very little interest in talking about the great successes. You pass them by, you just park them. Anyway, so I've been asked to talk about my background and career, and I want to start by saying that, I do see myself not as one of these stellar people who was going to be successful from birth and has known all, every time and every place has known that they were the cleverest person in the room. I've probably never been the cleverest person in the room, but I have been in the room with people who are the cleverest in the room, and they're really inspiring, and I sort of admire them and sort of envy them. But that isn't me, so I hope nonetheless I'll be able to say something that will be interesting and useful to you, and perhaps some of you will feel that you share that characteristic, that you're good, but you're aware there are people who are really absolutely top drawer. Anyway, my path's been different. I also, in the spirit of the times, need to talk a bit about my upbringing. I had a pretty privileged, fortunate upbringing in England. I was born into and lived a life of relative affluence and security, benefited from Britain's traditional class system. I'm an educated white man. All of these things have conferred advantage. And I think one of the things that that upbringing gives people, perhaps fallaciously, is this sense that whatever happens in life, you're going to be okay, and you and the people around you will be okay. And that's a very fortunate position to be in, and not always deserved. The other thing to say is that I haven't always given that impression to other people, who will get used to my sort of thinking everything's disastrous, and it turns out not to be. Anyway, I was born in London, but very early in my life I moved to what the residents call God's own county in Yorkshire, in the northern city of Leeds, home to the once mighty Leeds United. And I mentioned this, but actually there's a note here from my wife, and she says, "That's enough football." So I had a moderately conventional upbringing for a doctor in the UK. I went to grammar school. My father was a doctor, a consultant haematologist. My mother's a teacher and a musician. I was the eldest of 3 children. And I suppose the thing that my parents gave me was the sort of paramount importance of education, and I think also the need to give your all. Don't go half in, just plough in and do the best you can. And I was always rather keen to please, but one of the things that was instilled into me was it's never quite good enough, but also pride comes before a fall. And so, never celebrate your successes too much, and never get too despondent by the things that go against you. And I think that's been a motive for my life, professional and personal. And to be fair, that's a bit of a double-edged sword. Sometimes people want to say, just celebrate your achievements, or just have a good, realise that that's quite good. And you're always thinking, well, it was quite good. Anyway, we'll come back to that. What was I like as a child? Well, I'm in this sort of spirit of what I've already been implying, really. It's clear to me some of the character traits I have now, for good or ill, were present from the beginning. I've always somewhat contradictory. I seem to be likeable enough, sometimes usually quite popular, but I feel quite shy. My wife jokes that I'm really not an extrovert, but I am an extrovert, and I just say, no, I'm not really, but I'm a sort of shy extrovert. Quite slow to join groups, sometimes sit on the edge. When I was at Cochrane, actually when I was at the BMJ, people go, oh, there's a networking meeting, you must go. And I'd go, oh God, do I really? Can I send somebody else? Surely there's somebody else that would like to do that. But actually I can be quite sociable, and usually, and often, sometimes I enjoy it. I'm pretty conscientious, pretty driven, but usually I try not to give that appearance. So I sort of like to think that I look relaxed and ambivalent, but usually I'm not. I'm usually very happy, as I have every right to be, given my privileges. But I'm always wanting to make things better. And I think that's one of the things that I want to say to you is about, you know, when you're in something, you get really involved in it, but always want to make things better. And I'm reasonably good at things, but I've never been really outstanding in anything. And some of you will be outstanding in things, and brilliant, good to you. But actually, quite a lot of us are quite good at everything. And sort of, you know, people always say you're a master of nothing, you know, jack of all trades, master of nothing. But actually, being good at a number of things is quite good. And that came across at school, and there I was, and at school, good at most things, not brilliant at anything. Mostly, I was interested in sport, a bit of music, mostly sport. I played piano, sang the choir, but played a lot of sport, basically. Like being a team player. I've always been a bit of a team person, rather than individual. And then I had to go to university, and I thought, well, what am I going to do at university? I have no idea at all. And somebody said to me, well, you've got to make your mind up in the next 24 hours. So I went to medical school. Now, of course, nowadays you can't do that, because if you, certainly in Britain, if you want to go to medical school, you've got to be thinking about being in medical school from about the age of 5. But I didn't do that. Maybe I was a bit privileged and I got in. Anyway, I was quite young when I made that decision, so it sounds immature, and it was. Anyway, I've mentioned all this background and contrast, and my message to you really is to point out this picture of this person growing up not totally driven towards a known target. You meet people who say, oh no, when I was 3 I knew I was going to do this. Well, I thought I was going to be all sorts of weird things, bus driver, a missionary, and medicine came quite late. Anyway, what I suppose I'm saying to you is you can go through life in that way, and it can turn out okay, and you can change quite late, as you'll find. So I went to medical school in 1978, just a year before the UK gained its first woman Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher. I was young for my age, and I was it's a single-sex school, we'll do that. And as a student, I sort of sat in what we would call the cycling peloton, you know, not at the front, not at the back, sort of in the middle. And I became quite political. I know this isn't a political lecture, and I'll stay away, but one of the consequences of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan being around at that time is that to many of the instructors and the young doctors that were teaching us and instructing us, and the anatomy demonstrators, seemed to me to be really cynical. And they would say to things like, well, there probably won't be a National Health Service by the time you qualify, it'll all be over. We were a bit more worried about the end of the world by then, because we were worried about nuclear apocalypse. But the idea that the NHS wouldn't be here was more disturbing and slightly disillusioning. And of course, it didn't turn out to be true, and people are still talking about it X years later. And maybe it won't be true this time either. But that cynicism I found quite dispiriting. And I really wasn't sure, surprise, surprise, what sort of doctor I wanted to be. And then I was allocated, I'm sorry about the photographs, best I could find. I was allocated to a doctor on a sort of a council estate in Bristol, not a very rich area of the city, called Alan Otlet. And this is probably the first time he's ever been mentioned in a presentation by anybody anywhere. Because he was a quiet, unassuming, old-fashioned doctor. He wasn't a professor, he wasn't an academic, he was, what he was a non-judgmental, caring, ridiculously conscientious person. He was aware of the science, he was up with the science, but it was always very lightly held. Nowadays we'd worry he was paternalistic, but most of all, he was just not at all cynical. There's nothing cynical about him at all. And I sort of loved working with him, really. He was the first really uplifting person I'd met at medical school. And so I decided I was going to be him. I was going to be a career GP, a family doctor. And that's what I decided to do. And I should say, this wasn't a universally popular decision in the family. My father thought GPs were sort of people that should be employed to, I don't know, sweep the streets or something. I don't know. He was quite wrong about that, by the way. But anyway, quite wrong about lots of things, as it turns out. Anyway, so Dr. Alan Otlet. And I think the thing that he taught me, really, and it was sort of maybe reignited in me, was this idea of it just wasn't enough to turn up and be clever. You have to always be looking to ways to improve. You've got to work hard. You've got to give people your all. You've got to, and those are the things he really exemplified. And anyway, I went to do vocational training in general practice, and I ended up. It's a terrible photograph, but it was the only one I could find of my old practice in Herne Hill in South London. And so if anybody knows the geography of London, the most important part of London is south of the river. Actually, the only important part is south of the river. And there's a hospital south of the river called King's College Hospital. And just south of there, you have Brixton, and you have more leafy areas like Dulwich, and Herne Hill's right in the middle of all that. And so I was a GP there, so really nice mixed area. And I became a GP, and it was okay. And like all people who get into general practice in England, and maybe elsewhere, I started to do other things. So I started to teach. I started to be an undergraduate teacher. I joined the undergraduate teaching program under the leadership of somebody you probably have never heard of called Professor Roger Higgs. And they were sort of amazing, really, because they had this visionary and collaborative learning culture that they built up, and they were obsessed about improving the quality of services to patients in an underprivileged area in London. And it was my first introduction to different forms of education. So away from the sort of didactic teaching in a lecture like this, much more small group, much more everybody being an expert and everybody learning and everybody teaching. Also, I came to know and admire a young woman who worked as a linchpin, it seems to me, of the department, but we'll come back to her. Less happily, and as so I sort of implied at the beginning, you learn more from your failures. Less happily, towards the end of my time in practice, I took on a job called clinical governance lead for the local area. So clinical governance had been brought in by the Labour government in 1997, and the idea was that we were all responsible not just for our own practice, but the practice of the people around us. So there was much more fixation on the performance of the unit as a whole, and indeed performance in general. And this one nominated person would be the person responsible for managing the performance of all of the family doctors in this little bit of South London. And it was a really terrible job. And I was really terrible at it. It just wasn't it just didn't play to my strengths at all. I loved the education piece, organising courses and things for people to learn about different bits of medicine and refresher courses for general practice. It wasn't fantastically modern, but I loved doing that. But when it came to the clinical governance lead, it was quite bad. And the sort of mad moment, particularly, was I'd been asked to go, on behalf of the people that were paying me to do this, to talk to a bunch of doctors in Lewisham, which is another place in South London. Don't think you need to know where it's near. It's not very nice. And I was talking to them about how it was really important to get appraised, because GPs weren't at that time appraised. Their staff were all appraised. Almost everybody else in the world was appraised, but GPs weren't. And so I was talking to them about how important it was to have this appraisal, so you had this idea of how you were doing. And people started hissing, which I'm hoping you're not going to do today, which is a very bad thing, I think. That never happened to me before, never happened since, I'm pleased to say. And I realised I was just in the wrong place. this was not the job for me. And unfortunately in Britain, we changed the structure of the health service every 6 months or so. And so when the next restructure came, I resigned and I never did that again. So you learn from your strengths and weaknesses. I realised there were things that I wasn't good at, as well as things that I maybe am better at. Anyway, my practice grew and developed, and I thought, well, this is me. This is what I'm going to be. This is the rest of my career, right here. I was married. I had 2 sons. Then I got divorced. In the practice, we had a tragedy. We had some upheavals. A young female doctor about my age at that time, a lot younger, was murdered by someone she met through a newspaper personal advert. It would happen on social media now, but that wasn't invented. And we had to move on, in the jargon, i.e. sack, 2 practice managers and a senior partner. All really difficult things to do for a young doctor just coming into the practice, suddenly finding everybody else had gone, suddenly I'm running the place. On a happier note, after the divorce, my relationship with the linchpin in the Department of General Practice, Ginny Morley, developed, and being both divorced, we formed a relationship, and Ginny's come with me on this trip, although she's currently at the beach. And together we have a daughter, Freya, add to the sons of my previous marriage, and as I say, we're still a couple, both working, enjoying our family, one grandchild, another on the way. And without Ginny's input, I don't think I would have made this change I'm just about to tell you about, and had the career I've had. And she's worked throughout this all the time. But you know, the mix has worked well for us. So I found myself quite young, leading a practice, and just hopelessly unequipped for most of the skills I needed as a leader and a manager. I was managing a bunch of people, because like many doctors, I sort of thought, well, I can be a doctor, so surely I can do everything. Management, leadership, surely it's just instinct, isn't it? You know, that's what I thought. I think I thought that. And I referred earlier to having to get rid of 2 managers, and both were very difficult, as I said. But the second one provided an incident that sort of sat with me, and as I was thinking about the various things I'd like to pass on to you, hopefully useful in your life somehow, I was thinking about the second one. So we appointed a young woman to be our practice manager. Went through a great process. We didn't stint on the process, but as soon after she arrived, it was soon obvious we'd made a big mistake. And the rest of the staff didn't like her, didn't respect her, found her difficult to work with. It was really clear it was unsustainable. And I prevaricated for too long. First mistake. Once the decision's clear, you've got to do something. And I just hoped it would get better, but it didn't get better. And then, in a sort of mild panic, I invited her for a one-to-one, a mutual appraisal. Let's see how things are going. And for that, I made just about every mistake you can make. So I didn't really give her any warning about what we were going to talk about. I sat her down, and because this is what I did when I was being a doctor, I said, well, how do you think things are going? Nice open question to start with. And she said, I think they're going really great. And I realised I'd just dug myself the deepest of deep pits, and I was going to have to dig my way out. And it was the next hour, we had the most painful and difficult and unnecessarily cruel thing, because at the end of the hour, she was going to have to leave the department, the practice. And it was painful for both of us, but I had no excuse. She had every excuse, really. It taught me a number of things. One is how not to do a meeting of that sort. And also, you can't really just wander into these jobs and assume that because you've got a degree in medicine, you can do anything. You know, you have to learn skills, and you have to respect that there are skills you don't have. Relying on my medical degree and natural instincts wasn't enough. And I had, so as a result of which, so out of bad things come good things, as a result of which I did a ton of management and leadership training, nearly all of which has come in useful since then. So I know a bit about myself, and I've had assessments, and people say I'm quite a good listener, and I'm slightly reluctant to be authoritarian. Well, we've been there, we've seen that. Hopefully I give people a chance to express their opinions. I'm pretty good at managing people who are dissenting, which turns out to be a good thing in at least one job. But I notice also I've worked with people who really don't like that, don't like their dissenters, they don't like that. I really think those people are of massive value. I'm quite anxious. Most people I think would call me neurotic. And that has its ups and downs for me, but I think sometimes it makes you avoid mistakes. I learned a lot about managing strategy and implementing strategy and doing things, and I've learned from other people. I learned from Muir Gray once said, you have to know the red line that means you would have to resign. And I think that's often quite a good thing when you enter into a negotiation. What's the, if this happens, I'm going to have to walk from this job. But everything else I can negotiate before we get there. And often I see, and I still see, particularly in Britain with doctors at the moment, who are in quite a bad way really. If something happens they don't like, they just want to punch their way through it. Surely if we just argue hard enough, the other people will give way, and they're not giving way. And I've learned that really clever managers and people in other areas are really good at sort of going, okay, so this is the world we have to live in. Why don't we bend it to our advantage? Why can't we make the best of it? And I've learned to be reasonably good at that. And I think it's a really important message. And I still see people, I think, making that mistake. Anyway, I carried on. I was quite popular with patients and colleagues, but I was really restless. I wanted our practice to be better than it was. It was quite good, but it wasn't as good as I wanted it to be. And I wanted me to be a better doctor than I was. I undertook training in family therapy and systems therapy, but I thought of visionaries in the work, visionary GPs like Julian Tudor Hart, who invented the term inverse care law to show how the people who needed it the worst got the worst care. And I was interested in a person called Roger Neighbour, who developed some earlier work on the consultation. This is indeed he. And I think when I started, the medical students of my era, we sort of thought this thing called, your bedside manner, which was your consulting method, was something surely it was just instinctive. You were born with it, right? You couldn't learn this sort of stuff. What a load of nonsense. But actually, there's a whole science that said quite a lot of scientific consultations are just woefully inadequate. People not listening, people having separate conversations, people failing to, wanting to jump to premature conclusions, all sorts of mistakes. And you hear audio tapes, you probably don't hear audio tapes, but whatever it is now modern people do instead of audio tapes, where the patient and the doctor are just talking a different language, and maybe English, but they're not talking to each other. And I began to think, actually, you do need to think about this seriously, and it's true in all walks of life, I think. And it changed my practice overnight. I stopped using the expression, "What can I do for you?" as the person walked in, and would ask some other open question that would allow us to talk about the thing before we decide what we're going to do. So I didn't jump to the end of the consultation when I wasn't ready. I did some psychodynamic courses, and I was eventually asked to contribute to a section for a book I meant to bring with me, just to prove it existed, written by a British entrepreneur. It's called Kindness. And I mention this really just to mention that, in fact, my entry comes just before that of Angelina Jolie. But sadly, it is my greatest claim for fame, but sadly nobody's ever read it or seen it. So I made mistakes, clinical and otherwise, and none of them led to anything bad, even though I knew even though I knew you have to make mistakes, I was a bit tortured by them. And then I was awarded a fellowship at the Royal College of General Practitioners, had to go to an investiture in London and listen to a guy called Per Fugeli, who was a professor of social medicine in Oslo, now died, and he gave a talk about the issue of trust between patients and doctors. And other people who went to that lecture, including my wife, it completely passed them by. But for me, it was a pivotal moment, and I think everything that's happened to me since, in some way, comes back to this lecture. And what he was trying to say was he identified 5 building blocks of trust between patients and doctors. And 3 of them I think were pretty obvious. One of them was personal doctoring, one was compassion, and the other was, obviously, compassion and personal doctoring. And I've written it here, so it's bloody well. Competence. Aha, who knew? Yeah, okay. Personal doctoring, competence and compassion. Those are the first 3, pretty obvious. But the 4th and 5th were the important ones that made a real impact on me. One was realism in medicine, being realistic about what you could actually do for somebody and not overspinning or selling it. And the other thing was sharing power. And it seems to me both those 2 principles are the harbingers of everything I've done since all this in evidence-based medicine. I do think evidence-based medicine is a sort of seeking after truth. You know, not seeking after spin or delusion or what we wish would happen. And once we've got it, you have to share it. You have to share that information in order that people can make informed decisions. It's sort of supposed to be authoritarian, not authoritarian, but facilitative. Anyway, my reasons for leaving general practice and giving up clinical medicine altogether were pretty positive, really. I was really flattered, mostly, that the BMJ wanted to appoint me for a job I was completely unqualified for. But there are some negatives. I remember a morning, sitting in a morning, aged 40-something, I think, a person comes in, oh, I've got really bad headaches. And I thought, oh yeah, headaches, I know what that is. I put what we then called an audio cassette into my brain, the headaches diagnosis and management tape, and it'll probably be a podcast now. And I went through the motions and gave this consultation. And as she walked out, I thought, am I really going to be doing this in 30 years' time? Is this what I want? Is this the best I can do? And then I also had a complaint from a patient. Well, actually not from a patient, but from a patient's relative. And it was my first and it was my last. And I'm mentioning it because almost nobody that I've come into contact with and even befriended in my subsequent career knows this story. So you're quite privileged. It's not something I talk about very easily because you don't, I don't think. And it was a bit ridiculous. This poor woman, patient of mine, knew her pretty well, had cancer, was clearly dying, and went into a hospice. And her son was really unhappy with the hospice's care. And then, so he decided he was going to arrange for her to come back home. And he rang me to say she's coming back home, and she came back home, and she died about 3 hours later. So absolutely awful, awful, awful ending. And he tried to complain about the hospice. I wanted me to help him. I wasn't there. How can I help him? I couldn't. So I did what I did. As I said, I couldn't. So he just then said, "Okay, I'm going to complain about you too." Okay, and he complained about me too. And I can. I'm not refighting the complaint. Well, it never came to anything anyway. But I can say I didn't do anything that I wouldn't do again, ever again. That's not the point. But the point is how it completely stopped me in my tracks. I became a different person. I was thinking about it every day, every night. I was questioning every consultation I had and wondering about whether it was the right thing. Oh God, have I done the right thing? Is it going to happen again? And since all this, I've heard people talking, including one of my mentors, Richard Smith, talking about how great complaints are, how brilliant they are about improving practice, and it's a really great sort of democratizing thing. And I can see that logically that's true. And I do ask myself why it was I wasn't more resilient. Why did it affect me so badly, even when I thought I'd not done anything wrong? But I think we're not well trained in this. At least I was not well trained. I probably wasn't well enough supported. But also I think I expected a level of perfection from myself, and I think possibly I'm not there alone in this amongst people, that was just unachievable. Anyway, age 43, I gave up being a clinical doctor and took this step into the unknown. Went to the BMJ, worked for Fiona Godley, who was my boss, and I was deputy editor of clinical evidence, and she was the editor. So it turns out it's not too late to change direction. I was 43 when I started at the BMJ. And it was a brave thing. I realise now it was a brave thing, and my patients and colleagues just thought it was incomprehensible. It was the making of me, really. I was ridiculously fortunate to have Fiona as my mentor. So this is the great Fiona Godley, and I mean, as a human being, she is pretty wonderful. She's engaging, generous, wise, respectful, calm, but she also managed to, she trained me really well. She's sent me to see people. She taught me things, but lots of what I learned from her was what I saw her do. You know, being fantastically respectful to people, even when they weren't necessarily being that nice back. Her rejection letters, I always thought, were sort of almost a love letter in terms of their respectfulness and calmness, and oh, it's not you, it's us, sort of, you know. Anyway, there's something lovely about them, and actually, when you see some rejection letters, actually, you know, they're really actually not respectful at all. I think that we'll have a lot to learn from Fiona. And in fact, I got a rejection letter from her. She asked me to. I went to a conference. She asked me to write. This is a sort of important message for you. She asked me to write an editorial about it. She said, pick a part of the conference and write about it, and concentrate on one aspect and go into it in some depth. So I thought, I don't want to do that. I want to write about a number of things. I think there are lots of things that are really important in this conference. I'm going to write about all of them. So I wrote about all of them, and she sent it back saying, why not write about what's the one thing and write in some depth? And I'm, no, there was lots of important things at that conference. So I sort of, you know, made a few trivial changes and sent it back. And I didn't hear any more. And a few weeks later, I said, you know, that editorial. And she said, yeah, I don't think it was quite right. And it taught me, maybe I was right. There were a few important things at that conference. But she was the editor of the journal. She made the decision. It was up to her what she wanted in the journal, and she'd asked me to do something, and I'd you know, almost consciously not done it. So I deserved what I got. But it's a message. You know, you're not writing for yourself. You're writing for somebody else, and that somebody else is trying to make a decision on behalf of the reader. Anyway, I once heard her say that she was very proud that she was my mentor. So, but you have to understand that, you know, all the gratitude is really the other way around. Anyway, she went off to be some other job as editor-in-chief of the BMJ or something, and I took her job and eventually became editorial director of the whole department, so clinical evidence, best treatments, which was patient-focused thing, and then we launched Best Practice, which is an e-textbook for healthcare professionals. You may be aware of it. And anyway, when I went into all of this, I really wanted to keep this idea, this perspective. How are we doing for time? Are you all right?
Don't worry.
I won't worry. Okay. I really wanted to keep this idea that I would keep my doctory head on, and I would be the person that would make sure that what we produced was really good for the doctors and nurses and people making decisions, right? And but it was quite hard to do, I found. Surprisingly hard to do. Evidence-based medicine was really dominated by efficacy studies, looking at drugs, concentrating just on randomized trials, and really fixated on the presence or absence of statistical significance, to the extent of being misleading. And I want to give two examples of how we came a cropper, by sticking to the rules, I should say. So in the first one, we published a review on paracetamol poisoning, paracetamol overdose. And we looked at all the evidence for acetylcysteine, which is a standard drug, I think, probably still used. I don't know, at the time it was used everywhere in the world for paracetamol poisoning. And Turned out there was only one randomised trial, and the one systematic review had been done, and it had found one randomised trial. And the randomised trial was done yonks ago, decades ago, and it was used old-fashioned techniques, and it only had 25 people in the treatment arm and 25 people in the placebo arm. And so we said, on the basis of these historic methods of allocation, concealment, and blinding, and sparse data, this is only limited value evidence. So we said there's only limited value evidence for this drug to work, and we sent it back to the authors. And they went ballistic. It was a really big mistake. And we'd done the things we said we'd do. We looked at randomized trials, and we studied those, and we put them through some pretty standard for the time checks on quality. And but the thing that we'd omitted was the fact that there was a whole wealth of evidence from large observational studies that conclusively showed the drug worked and it saved lives. And so for us to be giving this message that there was just limited evidence for this drug, which people will take as a recommendation, even though it isn't one, was really hopelessly inadequate. And we got the drubbing we deserved for it. Unfortunately, we changed it, but I think it had been published by then. Anyway, and the second example was an example of creams for eczema. It was written by an enormously eminent evidence-based person who I love and admire and revere, and he had written that this cream, in people with eczema, this cream was positive when looked at from clinician-reported outcomes, but not for patient-reported outcomes. And I thought, well, that's a bit odd, isn't it? Why would that happen? So I looked at the forest plot, and this is not the forest plot, I've just redrawn a forest plot that's broadly similar. But this is what we found. The numbers, I think, are accurate. So if you look at these, if you read that report, you think that's dichotomously different, don't you? There's an effect, there isn't effect. But actually, you look at these results and you go, they look a bit the same to me. The relative risk, the risk ratio is about the same. And the only difference is that one is only just statistically significant and one is only just not statistically significant. And actually, the cause of it is the fact that one result is slightly more precise than the other. But actually, they're the same. But by going by the rules, which apparently were sort of rules of nature, we were giving a very misleading message, and it really sat with me, and I was worrying about it, and I got myself thinking, we're not doing a good enough job. So then I fell in with the grade group, and this was the rescue for me. And not everybody agrees with this, but I'm going to say it anyway. And it seemed to me that then and now, the grade group stands for Grading of Recommendations, Assessment, Development and Evaluation Group, and they've been around since the turn of the century. A bunch of people, a working group, who got together to think about how you join up evidence reviews to decision making. And specifically to talk about the quality of evidence and indeed the certainty of evidence. And this isn't a talk about grade, but and I'm not a person that's been I've been an observer of grade rather than somebody who's actually shaped it. But it seems to me a pretty important step in medicine, and still is a group that meets twice a year, massively international, very involved in grade and guidelines. And so you might ask the question, well, what's so special then? I think it's special for a number of reasons. Firstly, the thing it's taken over from, and numerous methods for judging quality were all a bit rubbish. And they revolved around numerals and letters, and nobody could understand, or at least I couldn't understand them. I'm sure everybody else could understand them, I just couldn't. And then it provides the answers to four big questions, particularly if we think about intervention reviews. We do it for lots of other things, but in intervention reviews, is there an effect? Is that effect, what's the direction of that effect? What's the size of the effect? And how sure are you that the effect you've measured and estimated is close to the true effect? And those are the sort of basics that you need to know when you're thinking about how you're going to put this into practice. It forces you to focus on a manageable bunch of outcomes, including harm, the ones that matter most, and then it centres on outcomes across the studies. And you might think, so what? It's obvious, right? But before, people used to look at study by study by study, but this study said this study said this. And when I was editing clinical evidence overviews, I'd be thinking, well, this first study said that, second study said that, systematic review said that. Okay. No, I've lost it. What did he say? I don't know. You know, so actually thinking about it from what are the outcome that matters to patients, and what are we thinking about that? Really important, I think. It's flexible, so randomized trials can be downgraded, as we've done with the paracetamol overdose thing, and observational studies can be uprated for sensible and consistently applied parameters. It makes you think about absolute effects as well as relative effects. Encourages you to think about thresholds, minimal important difference. What's a big effect? What's a moderate effect? And it's transparent. You can disagree with it. You can say, well, you judged it that, but I would say it's different. And last thing, if you're asked to give a 15-minute summary of a 200-word systematic review to the BBC in a quarter of an hour, which has happened to me, I think, twice, and you haven't read the systematic review, you actually may have a chance if you've got a summary of findings table in front of you, whereas if you've got no chance at all, if you've got to read 250 pages in 15 minutes. So after my first meeting, I decided that we were going to incorporate grade into clinical evidence, and nobody supported that decision back in London, but we just did it anyway. And I was pleased. And of course, now people are saying, oh, you know, the organisation's always quite happy to take credit when it goes well. But as my role developed, I was doing less and less of the content editing, and more and more of all the other managerial stuff. I was sort of back where I started. And I was also having to learn new stuff, developing technologies, new vocabs and contents, and some editorial and production processes, methodology. And it was just great. I loved it. So what did I learn? So I learned that the BMJ knew I didn't know very much about evidence, and I knew absolutely nothing about editing when they appointed me. But they knew I might be able to learn and acquire those things. But I also found that things I already knew about were transferable. And that I'm sure will be true for you if you decide to change shift gear at any point. Things that you knew from one area transposed to another. So this was managing people, it was leading things. So all the training that I'd done in general practice when I made these terrible blunders in earlier lives. And I was learning new things. I was learning about technology, and I was learning about scientific publishing and project management and stuff. And then after 6 years, I went off to be editor-in-chief at Cochrane. And I was interviewed I was interviewed at Heathrow Airport, in fact, and met Peter Tugwell for the first time. And Peter's been a mentor ever since. And the reason for talking about Peter is we've worked together now ever since that day, which is 2003. And Peter's been a really important mentor to me, but we don't always agree. Sometimes Peter can be quite tricky. I suppose I can be quite tricky, but Peter can be quite tricky, I'm just saying it. And we've had periods of time when we weren't particularly friends. But throughout that time, usually Peter has rescued the relationship, and he's been enormously valuable to me. And even now, he's retired from working with me. But I still want to think, what would Peter do in this difficult editorial situation? And usually I get the answer from that. So anyway, I was going to go to the interview. I asked my colleague Louisa Dillner what she thought. She said, yeah, it's good, David, because you like working with mad people, so you'll probably be quite good at it. Okay, is that a good thing? Is that all positive? I think she meant it positive. So anyway, I went to the interview, and I was pretty sure there was a moment where I got the job, because there were loads of people at that interview. They were rather indiscreet about telling you who else they were interviewing. And they're a lot more methodologically sound than me. But I put this slide up. It's a pretty ugly slide, let's all agree. But it had this quote from Marquis Lecain. It was Lafayette, de Lafayette. I think a bunch of people have actually been ascribed this quote. I've noticed that since. But the idea was, I'm their leader, therefore I must follow them. And this was, I was really trying to say, look, I know if I'm parachuted into Cochrane, I'm going into this organisation, a bunch of people who know an awful lot about evidence-based medicine and about methodology and all this stuff. And, I can't just sit there and tell them what to do. So I will be learning from them, and it's about me, how I get the best out of them, really. It's not really about issuing orders. So anyway, 10 years in Cochrane, what can I say? It was really the best time of my life. It was really hard. I wrote here bloody. It was a bit bloody at times. It was exasperating. Leading a group of people I didn't employ, some of whom didn't want me there. To live a change which almost nobody wanted, in which every step of the way was questioned and everything was a challenge. And in the first few weeks in the job, I went to meet a very senior pioneer of Cochrane in his university town in Nottingham. He sat down, he smiled at me, and he said, "What I really want to know is how do we get rid of you?" And, okay, well, I still think it's my problem, mate. So it was challenging. I had no office, I had no staff, had to get a budget. I was able to recruit a brilliant team of young people, spiky, committed, information specialist, brilliant editors, and they all were always willing to tie their hands at just about everything. I just loved all of them. I was probably overprotective of them when we were challenged. The probably is doing nothing in that sentence. I was overprotective of them. And again, I found some of my experiences were transferable. And I also found that it's really important to be prepared to appoint people who are cleverer than you, or better than you, or more experienced than you, or more well-known than you. And so teamwork, I could stand here and go, oh, I'm really lucky, I've had this great team, I've had this great team, I've had this great team. But I have to acknowledge that there's partly that is, I have to take some credit for that, limitedly, but I have to take some credit. I do work people hard, but I think I'm quite fair, so be fair to people. Respect people's contributions, help them to develop, make it clear that we have to achieve things. One thing in Cochrane, we always had to keep making sure we had things we could report, because people were sure going to hold us to account. But we had a great deal of fun. We had, and to be honest, a lot of those things just came naturally to me. I don't really think, oh, I must be nice to people. Usually I just am, and but there are some things there are skills and attributes you have that will come naturally to you, and everybody else will think, oh, they're really great for that, but you think they're straightforward, but they're not always straightforward. But sometimes that closeness to the team got us into trouble, and I wasn't probably quite good enough at managing upwards and all that stuff. And we're supposed to be looking after 52 review groups, the library, everything content-wise at Cochrane, the publishers, the tech teams, the review groups, the contributors, the readers, the funders, and things could have gone better. Some things could have gone better, and there are people I could have used more. But when I left, people were very positive. Amazingly, from what I've just said. But I can be clear that people thought I'd done an okay job, or just they were pleased to see the back of me. Anyway, in my current job, I've just gone back to submitting it. Being a straightforward editor, and I'm loving doing it. It's a nice stress-free existence, and I've come to realise more clearly than before there are some really important things. So I pass these on as hopefully useful to you in thinking about your journal publishing in the future. Really make sure you send your manuscripts to the right journal. All journals have this idea of the thing in medicine that they cover. And it's not actually always obvious from the title of the journal. Take note, Journal of Clinical Epidemiology, which is a methods journal, but we only just mentioned that now in our little subtext. So people send us articles thinking, well, you're interested in clinical epidemiology, so this is for you. But it's not for us unless it's about methods. So all journals have the bits that they're interested in. Make sure you tick them, because that's the quickest form of rejection. Good article, interesting subject, but not for us. And the editor's the judge of it, so you don't get to change their mind usually. Write a great letter. The great letters say, this is why this is really good, this is what we already know, this is what this adds, and this is why this is a really good match for your journal. And actually, even when they're wrong about that, it's often quite difficult to say, oh, it's quite difficult to argue against sometimes. And sometimes it persuades you. Use the help that's out there, methods, guides, reporting guidelines. Make that obvious. Send in your checklists. Be transparent. Don't spin. I know everyone says it's all about impact, it's all about impact. But don't make up impact. Don't say this is a breakthrough. Every morning on the radio I hear some researchers say this is a new breakthrough in dementia care. Yeah, how many of those have we had? Avoid spin, don't exaggerate, accept there are remaining uncertainties. And when I'm writing, and Anna might disagree with this, but I would say, and Fiona would say, were she here, keep emotion out of it. Do not, take every word that finishes ly in English, just delete it. Nobody wants to see an adverb. It's much more powerful if you take your emotion out of it. And they're perfectly willing, perfectly happy to argue the reverse. But anyway, that's my feeling about it. That's what I was asked to come and talk. So give very complete reporting. Don't just bend it around the few results that worked the way you wanted them to. Don't rely too much on statistical significance, said that. And of course, for now and the foreseeable, you really have to think about open science, replicability, and so on. I'm really sorry, I'm a long way behind. But I'm now going to turn to some recommendations, and I'll try and be a bit faster. Are we okay? Are you about to kill me? Okay.
You're peaceful people.
Okay. So what have I learned? I've got about 6 things that I've learned that I want to just pass on to you, and hopefully they're useful. First is ride the waves. You see people whose lives seem to be going straight up, and then nothing bad ever happens to them, and it's going on and on and on. Britain has a Prime Minister for whom this was true until, about now. But most people, in their lives, you have bad things happen, you have setbacks, things don't go the way you want. Ride the waves. And I've talked about a few of them, but in 2018, May, Cochrane produced a review called Prophylactic Vaccination for HPV Vaccine Review, for human papillomavirus. And to be honest, it hadn't been an easy review. We had a lot of trouble with the authors, and they probably had a lot of trouble with us. And it had been a bit of a negotiation getting to the point of publication, but we thought we'd published a good enough review. And we published it, and about 2 months later, some people we worked with closely in the past published in another journal an article that completely condemned it as being not fit for purpose. And we were totally rocked by it. We felt really defeated by it because we knew these people, and they hadn't even warned us they were doing it. And it was really difficult, and it's a really important topic. It's not something you can get wrong, right? And of course, their article, I would argue, played into the hands of the anti-vaxxers. We're not really supposed to be doing that, although we are supposed to be seekers after truth. So, with all its uncertainties, and anyway. I must confess I was quite at a loss what to do, and then somebody else in the team came up with the idea we just have to sit back, we have to take it on the chin, we have to go back to it, look at what they're saying, and we have to answer it, and then we have to publish it. And that's what we did. And all I can say to you is, instead of just crumbling, standing up, taking the things, acknowledging it wasn't perfect, acknowledging there were some things that were arguable, but defending yourself where you think you were, that's the answer, is what you had to do. And doing that, I think, and then publishing it, brought about an enormous sense of calm. It was really the right thing to do. And I think that, that's a really important, in a way it's a message, isn't it? You will be criticised. Everybody in this room that publishes something will be criticised. And, you just sit back, accept the things you got wrong, but be prepared to argue your case. And anyway, the last thing on riding the waves is knowing when to go. And I stopped being a GP, and I stopped working at BMJ, and I stopped working at Cochrane. And in each case, I knew it was the right decision at the time. And people I was working with were surprised in each case, I think. But I think it's important to know, to accept yourself when you've done all you can do in a place. Always leave well. People always say to me, I don't want to fuss, I don't want to party, don't want any presents. It's nonsense. Always have a party, always accept everything that's going. gives you a chance to say thank you, if nothing else, and it helps you. So leaving well is really important, and then you go to your new job and it's really difficult. Just get your head down, keep smiling, and get at it. Build your network is the next thing. Life and research are collaborations, and really important. It's not all about you, and Cochrane for a long time has not allowed single author reviews, for lots of reasons I could go into, but they're pretty obvious. Even now, I see an article with one name on it, I'm thinking from the beginning, hang on, has this person really got the breadth? Why is this person writing on their own? Usually it's a man, actually. Because it's a team game, people play different roles, and you've got to really, that's a really important aspect of it. People bring different skills to the article, and that's a great thing about producing considered work. Treat people with respect. And that came across in the Research Integrity Conference in Athens last week, when people from the Global South, researchers were saying sometimes in research teams that were with researchers from high-income countries, they didn't actually get the treatment and respect and attention that they deserved. What am I doing? Oh, that was dangerous. So respect people, respect your colleagues and also your opponents. It's really important that people don't always agree, and it doesn't mean to say everybody are wrong. Be prepared to rethink what you've said and hear what people say, and don't always assume that the answer is the people that aren't in the room just have to get better at their job. It's a very easy thing. I've seen it in every job I've ever done. The person who's not in the room is the person that needs to change. Probably the person in the room needs to change. Two things about evidence. One, it's subject to different interpretations. So I've twice picked up a phone to be told that I was personally responsible for the deaths of tens of thousands of patients. It's a great thing to happen to you. The first time, it was because Cochrane had made a mistake in a review. We'd made the ridiculous error, grade 1 error, of equating evidence of absence with absence of evidence. And we suggested something didn't work when it was uncertain. It was an important thing, and we changed it, and it doesn't say that anymore. The second one, though, was more pivotal, really, for us, because Cochrane isn't supposed to do 2 reviews of the same subject, but it happened. And 2 reviews looked at salt reduction in people with to reduce blood pressure. And so 2 reviews were done, and both of them found that if you reduce your salt intake, you reduce your blood pressure by about 3 to 4 millimetres of mercury. And so, yeah, it's a good thing, right? Two reviews both found the same thing. But no, in fact, because one lot was a group of, I think, primary care doctors from Scandinavia, they said, they looked at the individual perspective and they went, what? You give up salt for reducing your blood pressure about that much? Why would you do that? It's a ridiculous thing to do. And that was their conclusion. They were a bit more polite about it. These people, actually the people ringing me, killing tens of thousands of patients, worked in public health, in hypertension, and they said, if everybody in the world reduced their salt intake and dropped their blood pressure by 3 to 4 millimetres of mercury, we'd save X 100,000 strokes a year. That's why I'm responsible for tens of thousands of people. It was a complete standoff, but the evidence was the same, but the interpretation was different. So evidence is, and you see many examples where it's a bit less clear cut, but the people just taking evidence and looking at different ways. And evidence is changing, and therefore be prepared to change. So, I talked at the beginning about my frustrations about evidence in 2003. Evidence is becoming much more diverse. We're now not looking only at randomised trials, and we're not only looking at efficacy questions, and we're looking at arms, and we're looking at answering different types of questions, we're looking at different forms of research. And some of them are then finding that the evidence is changing. I was on a ward as a maternity ward as a young doctor, and the one day we said to people, I know yesterday we said nurse your babies on their tummies, but actually you've got to nurse them on their backs. or on their side. That happened in one day, and people said, I'm pretty sure you said the reverse yesterday, and that's because the evidence changed, and people had to accept it. And during the COVID pandemic, we all were wrong about something. I was wrong about quite a few things, and but the evidence changed, it refined, and actually we found these things that did look promising after about 1.5 studies with 20 people in them weren't so promising when you looked at the big studies. And be prepared to change your mind. And you still find people who held on to the idea that ivermectin was really effective, or this or that, or this, and sort of double down, and that sort of leads you to conspiracy thinking. But evidence is changing, the whole business of evidence is changing, and be prepared to change your mind. And this particularly brought home to me this great series by Philippe Revaux and Isabelle Boutron, and there was another article by Ellie Ackle, which we published in the JC before my time, actually. I peer-reviewed it, The Future of the Evidence Ecosystem. It's really started to talk about the fact that evidence, as it was currently configured, wasn't really fit for purpose in many, many different respects. And we could talk about the numerous faults of mentioned conflict of interest, the role of the drug companies, bias, spin, research waste, all those things that meant that for a lot of reasons, not enough engagement with stakeholders, it just wasn't working. And so I think you are now at a time when evidence is being reinvented. And we're going quite a long way down the track with lots of different methods, lots of different data sources, lots of different outputs. But this is a great time to be involved in evidence of all sorts, of biomedicine and lots of other things. Anyway, I'm really aware of time. I did time this before, I was slower before. And so this is my last recommendation to you. I make a big thing about really committing to anything you get involved in. It's really important. And if you're a boss, seeing people, you do judge people by their perceived level of commitment, although I know you can be wrong about that. Particularly when remote working. But you have to always remember that you are not your job. And so I'm going to finish with a single quote from the well-known German philosopher and ex-manager of Liverpool Football Club, who said, and well, actually he didn't say, but this is a paraphrase. He could have said, your work is one of the most important things in the list of things that are not that important. And there I think I should stop. Thank you.
Well, many thanks, David. While you're preparing interesting questions for David, I would like to share some of my notes. So I didn't know David good enough to know all these things about him. So things that I found interesting and inspiring was when he said that when he was growing up and when he was about to choose university, he didn't know what he wanted to be. Maybe you were in the same position. Maybe you were also one of these people that didn't know from the age of 3 that you want to be this or that when you grow up. So, I think it's fine not to know what you want to be and, when you figure out what you want to be, to change later. So, change of job at 42.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is also interesting. So he was a general physician. He said he was liked by the patients and he was liked by the colleagues, but he felt he wasn't happy enough in this position, and he was brave to share the confidential story with us about how criticism from a patient that he didn't feel was justified affected him a lot, and that he felt that maybe he was not resilient enough to accept even the unjustified criticism. That was then a radical transition from being a general physician or even clinical governance to go to the world of BMJ and to become an editor. So I think this is another important lesson for all of us, is that if you're not happy our job, we can try something completely different. We don't have to do the same thing all life if we're not happy in a certain role. You can always change. And now I'm 46. And I keep talking to people my age, and they tell me, oh, I'm old, it's too late. No, I can't do anything now. And I always tell them, so imagine that you will go to retirement when you're 65. So you have 20 more years to work. So 20 years of work is a lot of time. Maybe you don't feel young anymore, but there is still a lot of opportunities to do something that you love. So if you're not happy at your current position, there are other positions. And just as he said, you ride the wave, he said, okay, maybe when you get to that other job, maybe it will not be perfect, but you can change again. So there will always be opportunities for people who are smart and hardworking, and it was very important, the emphasis on being aware of your transferable skills. That, the skills that you have in the job that you're doing now, that you can transfer them and you can use them for a different job, and you can put them in the good use in a different setting. Because as David said, you have many skills that maybe you don't call them like that, managerial, leading, etc., that you can use in a different setting. So I love the importance of mentoring emphasis. So as David said, he was fortunate when he moved to BMJ, he worked with Fiona Godley, which he described as a great mentor. And then when he came to Cochrane, he was fortunate to work with Peter Tagle. So Peter Tagle was instrumental, also helped us a lot to establish Cochrane here in Croatia. So Peter is a very generous man, very inspiring. So that also, when you find a good mentor, that's a great gift in life to learn from great mentors. So I also like David's modesty when he said, I wasn't cleverest. I was good enough. And I think this is also a good message. Okay, maybe we don't have to believe that, that he's not cleverest or something like that. But we don't have to be the smartest people in the world. We don't have to be the best at something. It's important that we do our best. That's important. So we don't have to be the best ever. We don't have to be perfectionists. And also personal life. As he said, David divorced, but then he found new love at work. So that was also, even after personal setbacks, maybe there are some new opportunities also in personal life waiting for us down the road. So, even if we divorce, it's not the end of the world. So I like his messages about employees. And he said that we should treat our collaborators. So he said, be fair, respect them, help them develop, and have fun. This is a great lesson. Yeah. So work is good, but we should also have fun and enjoy people. So then in the end, David highlighted multiple take-home lessons that all of us can apply in our professional and personal life for further inspiration. And sometimes we go down in life, but then we go up. Recently, I saw a picture of ECG, with like heart monitor signs, and then it says, "This is life." This is like life. And if this was flat, it means you're dead. So it's normal, you have ups and downs in life, but this only means that you're alive. That's good. So now, if you have some tough questions for David, please.
I have one. Sure. So when you switched from being a general practitioner to a member of publishing or a journal, did you miss that sense of direct clinical benefit that you can give to the patients? For example, I myself was a general practitioner before joining here as a member of faculty, and although I like my position here very much, I think that the thing I lack the most is being able to help so directly and so easily, on a daily basis. And here I get to educate future doctors, but that's something I will be able to maybe see the effect in like 5, 10, 20 years or so, if ever.
It's a good question, and I find it hard to answer. I remember in the phone conversation with Fiona when she offered me the job. I said, "Oh, maybe I could do it 4 days a week and stay as a GP 1 day a week." And I thought she'd say, "Oh yeah, sure." And she said, "Oh no, it's a full-time job. You have to decide." And And I was rather pleased about that because it turned out to be quite a busy full-time job with tons of travelling. I don't think I missed it as much as I expected to. And I do always think that I enjoyed consulting. And I can look back now and think, but sometimes people ridiculously still ask me about some medical thing that they've got and what do I think. I don't know, what on earth are you asking me for? I sort of still enjoy those conversations. They're good conversations, they're fun. I didn't like the pressure we had. I always had an hour's worth of patients in the waiting room. And it seems to me there are doctors that you can divide everybody in life into two, can't you? But one way you can divide them into doctors into two is some have people waiting an hour in the waiting room, and some people leave on time. And I think the people that leave on time are probably pretty good doctors too. They're just a bit more efficient. So I always found it pressurizing. But I do miss it. When I look back now and I think, well, maybe I should have just kept doing it a bit. But actually, at the time, I honestly didn't think I missed it at all, really. And I really expected to. I really expected that I would be drawn back by the thought of never seeing a patient again. And I wasn't. So it's an interesting one. I guess the short answer to your question is, I thought I'd miss it more than I did.
Some more questions? Comments? Okay, Romana and then Nancy.
So you mentioned at the beginning that you are somewhat jack of all trades.
Yeah.
I wonder how someone who is jack of all trades by personality manages to become so focused in life to have a brilliant career as you had and still have. Do you have any advice for those who are also jack of all trades? How to focus more on one thing, maybe two?
Well, Fiona always used to say, at any one time, you can only have three big work priorities in your head in any given year. And in most of the jobs I've done, there's been a number of different elements of it. So at Cochrane, we had the relationship with the publishers, we had the relationship with the tech people. People kept trying to involve me in conversations about, what platform we should have, as if I knew anything about that. And for quite a long time, I just assumed that methodology could sit somewhere else and people would tell me the answer. And then I realized actually that wasn't going to work. And so I had to be able to hold my own in a conversation with methodologists. So I sort of made sure I could. Sometimes it's quite good for jack of all trades people for someone to say, look, actually, I know you think you're quite good at all these things, but we really need to focus on that at the moment. And so at Cochrane, after I'd been there about a year or so, I had a bunch of people in my ear, not saying when are you going to leave, but people like Paul Garner and, let's say people like Paul Garner, saying, Martin Burton and a bunch of other people, you have to focus on the quality of reviews. The reason we agreed to have you, against our better judgment, to have an editor-in-chief at all, they didn't know it was me at the time, was because we wanted somebody to do something about the uneven quality of Cochrane reviews. I don't think I'd said anything about that at my interview, and I don't think anyone asked me about that at the interview. But it turned out that for probably 20 or 30 of the coordinating editors, the 52 groups, 20 or 30 leaders, that was the only really reason that there was for having me. And so for 3 or 4 years, that is what we focused on. And of course, that then also has brings in other things. So you're having to negotiate with people about what's good enough. So you have to be able to talk to the methodology, but you also have to know how to negotiate. And you have to be prepared to think about, okay, well, what's the problem? Why are we doing it? Why is this happening? Well, it's happening because we're relying on volunteers, and somewhere in Cochrane's dim and distant past, there was the concept that anybody could write a Cochrane review, and it was the job of review groups to help them do it. Well, systematic reviews have evolved even in 2009 when I got there. Systematic reviews have evolved a long way from being something a completely undertrained person could start to do. And so, you know, there were a bunch of different skills, even in relation to one thing, which was review quality. So I don't know if I can really answer that question, but that would be my thing, you know, just recognize, sometimes you have to recognize what are the real imperatives. I have to go after those imperatives. At the BMJ, you would be maybe surprised to hear, it is you have to make a profit. Clinical evidence had to make a profit because the BMJ group was dependent on, well, actually it was mostly dependent on the classified ads in BMJ ads, but products like mine had to make enough contribution to that profit to be allowed to get away with it, and then we had to focus on that. And what are the content things that mean you're successful, and that's of course being a good product is part of that. So, you know, I was always thinking, I'm not going to think about how much money we make. I'm going to think about how we make a really great product, and then people will buy it, which is sort of worked while I was there. While I was there, anyway.
So pick your priorities.
Pick your priorities. And also sometimes it's a blessed relief not to feel you have to concentrate on everything. You know, you think, okay, I just have to concentrate on that thing. I'm going to do that, and that's quite a nice feeling for people who haven't historically done that.
Nancy?
Yes, so I wanted to know, how do you deal with all those negative comments and accusations, like you killed 10,000 people? I mean, do you get many such comments? How do you, do you take it personally or?
Well, it would be wrong to say I dealt with it brilliantly. At every opportunity I dealt with it brilliantly, because I didn't. And I had Sarah Zaviza, who's now the editor at Cochrane, who I think is a bit more combative than me. I think we could probably agree with that. She wouldn't think that's criticism. She used to say, "Oh, David, you'll never guess what such and such a person said about you on Twitter." And I'd say, honestly, just don't tell me. I don't need to know that. You know, I'm sort of on Twitter, but you know, I haven't seen it yet, so that's okay. I don't really look at notifications, so that's okay. So sometimes you can just avoid it, you know. But mostly you have to hit it straight on. And with those two things, they were different. And both of the people were very, very eminent people. And you know, the fact they were taking the trouble to ring me, you know, they had to have a decent answer. So I was aware we had to at least consider the content of what they were saying. And I think, and as I said in the first example, I thought we'd got it wrong. So I had to go back to that group of also quite esteemed researchers and say, look, what you said about this group is not right, and it's not how it should, and you need to change it. And they, to be fair to them, they did it without any fuss. I think the criticism did, I think, warm me down a bit after a while in the end. But also, you've got to remember that a lot of people are not criticising you. You know, a lot of 95, I don't know what percentage of people were being very charming and polite and positive, and aren't you doing well, and isn't it great, you know, bringing Cochrane together, and blah, bblah, blah. And so, you know, you've got to try and hear the positives. It's really easy. If you come from Yorkshire, it's almost impossible to actually take someone saying you're doing a good job and not just go, oh yeah, shut up. But what am I doing wrong? But you know, you have to get the balance right a bit. It was difficult, but it wasn't impossible. It wasn't impossible, and I don't think I'm particularly tough. Quite tough, but I'm tougher than I look. But I don't think I'm abnormally resilient. I think, you know, I was blown off course a few times.
Given the different contexts we have today in publishing, what
Yeah.
with either archive, fraud, paper mills, and so on, do you
Yeah.
still think that with all that you would make the same decision today to change from a GP to publishing, if you were that age?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think there are some There are some fantastic things happening, I think. I mean, there are some awful things happening. You know, I don't want to sound like Mr. Sunshine. I don't think there's ever a risk of that, really. But anyway, you know, there are some really challenging things happening, aren't there? You know, the obvious one I didn't mention, it's actually in the text, but I missed it out by mistake, about artificial intelligence. What is going to be the effect of artificial intelligence on research, scientific research and report writing and journals and so on? And, you know, nobody, I don't think, can sit here and say they know. It's going to undoubtedly make it more difficult to detect wrongdoing. It's going to make it easier to do wrongdoing. It might make it possible to detect wrongdoing in time. You know, all the time I've been in this business, people have worried about open access, and people have told me that open access will kill all the journals. Well, it doesn't seem to have killed any of the journals, and we seem to have more journals than ever. So, yeah, no, but you know, some really great things happening. You know, the conference last week, you know, over 40 projects in the EU are looking at research integrity and looking at building a better research culture and making sure that people get rewarded for the right things and not rewarded for the things that actually aren't, you know, they shouldn't be rewarded for. So you know, there are some really fantastic things happening because, you know, there are people in the world who are thinking about how to make things better. And actually, as evidence changes, it's about making things better. People want to make evidence better for patients and populations. So there's much more focus on equity and inequity. There's much more focus on diversity in research. We're nowhere near where we want to be, but there are steps in the right direction and challenges ahead. It's a good time. It's a good time. It's exciting.
Great. I suggest we finish with these optimistic words.